Jesus sets himself up as the example. And I want to get really granular with this because a friendship with Jesus is different than a friendship with me or a friendship with you. Like, I think I'm a good friend, but I'm not your Savior. You're probably a good friend, but I'm never going to call you Lord. That's Jesus. And the way Jesus interacts with his disciples, I think, should be a tremendous model for us. For example, we're called to forgive people like Jesus did with Peter. Have you ever had somebody betray you? Were you being arrested and tried unjustly? Did they, in your worst moment, deny they ever knew you? That's what Peter did to Jesus. And yet he forgave them. We forgive people in relationships because Jesus did that with Peter. We also call it the potential in people, like Jesus did with John. Sometimes being a friend with somebody is saying, hey, I see this in you. And you don't think you're capable of this, but I see this in you. This is what happened with John. John, whose book we were just reading, when he was there for those experiences, he was a teenager. 15, 16 years old. I don't know about you. I'm not sure I would trust the carrying on of the most important message in the world to somebody who can't legally drive. But Jesus saw the potential in John and he called it out of him. Jesus also spoke compassionately to people, like he did with Thomas. Thomas said, I'm not going to believe Jesus until I see the holes in his hand and the hole in his side. And so Jesus comes back and he says, Thomas, you idiot, what's wrong with you? Weren't you there? Don't you see me here now? That's not what he says. He says, Thomas, come here, touch. Stop doubting and believe. He speaks compassionate to people who have doubt. Jesus reaches out to messy people, and so we reach out to messy people like Matthew. What do you mean messy people, Scott? The people that other people judge for their obvious sin. Matthew's a tax collector. Nobody likes taxes. Nobody likes anybody who makes money on top of taxes. Imagine you go to H&R Block and they tell you, this is how much you owe, and then by the way, here's the extra amount we're going to take too. And by the way, there's not like down the street you can go to another person to do your taxes. This is the only option. Jesus goes to that guy's house. He spends time with that guy. That makes you uncomfortable. How about this? We extend grace to misled and confused people like Jesus did with Judas. Judas had an idea of who Jesus was going to be, and Jesus was not going to be that. And yet Judas had a place even at the Last Supper. And I'm convinced that he may have taken his own life in the end, but I think the same grace that Jesus later extends post-resurrection to Peter, I'm convinced he would have given the same grace to Judas if Judas had given him the chance. And so we extend grace when people are misled and confused. And then finally, maybe the most uncomfortable one of all, we eat with people who hold extreme political views like Jesus did with Simon the Zealot. You probably, like me, have some friends who share some wild things on Facebook. Some things you're like, oh, do I mute them again? Do I hide them for another 30 days? Do I unfriend them? What do I do? In the disciples, there was 12. And there's 2 of them that I think we don't consider the way they compared. Simon the Zealot was someone who, before he began following Jesus, was trying to overthrow Rome through violent means. Rebellions, riots, physical attacks. Those were the zealots. They believed that the Jews should not be ruled by the Romans. They were like basically the far, far right in our world. And yet, Simon is there at the Last Supper with Jesus. So's Matthew. And Matthew's the guy who's helping the Romans, who's collaborating with the Romans. So you have somebody who's progressive and somebody who's alt-right sitting at the table with Jesus. And friends, if Jesus had room at his table for somebody with extreme political views, and we're called to walk in the model of Jesus, be careful before you write somebody out of your life because they don't agree with your politics. If there's room in the 12 for Matthew and Simon, there's got to be room in our life for people that we don't agree with. Now, there may be times where you need to have a conversation about what they're saying or what they're posting. That's different. But just because they don't agree with the way you vote doesn't mean they get to be your friend. See, what we see here again and again is that if you're grateful to have a friend like Jesus, then you need to model your relationships after him.